Hey, and welcome to another episode of Cult Life with me, your host, Robin Jackson, episode 19. And this episode is all about battered spouses and the conflicting and dangerous advice coming through from the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses have had a very checkered history of giving conflicting advice with regard to many issues affecting the members' lives. They include the writings with regards to black people, blood transfusions, organ transplants, and domestic violence. Now, all the aforementioned have seen their fair share of flip-flopping and doctrinal change under the guise of what they call New Light. But I want to dwell on the issue of domestic violence in the show. Jehovah's Witnesses have been in the news lately concerning an article in the December 2018 Watchtower magazine. But before we get there, let's explore some previous writings of the Watchtower. And I want to take you back firstly to the Awake magazine, a magazine that's also published by the Watchtower, the Awake magazine of 2001. And this magazine actually gives some good advice to spouses who are dealing with physical and emotional and verbal abuse. So let's look what it says under the heading Help for Battered Women. And I quote from the magazine, and I'll read it out. It says, "What can be done to help women who are victims of violence? First, one has to understand what they are going through. Often the harm inflicted by batterers is more than physical. Verbal threats and intimidation are usually involved so that the victim is made to feel worthless and helpless. Consider Roxana, whose story was recounted in the opening article. Sometimes her husband uses words as weapons. He calls me demeaning names, Roxana confides. He says, 'You didn't even finish school. How could you care for the children without me? You're a lazy, hopeless mother. Do you imagine that the authorities would let you keep the children if you left me?' The article goes on to say, Roxana's husband maintains his control by keeping a tight rein on money. He doesn't allow her to use the car, and he calls throughout the day to check on what she is doing. If she expresses a preference, he throws a fit of rage. As a result, Roxana has learned never to express an opinion. As can be seen, spouse abuse is a complex subject, the Watchtower goes on to say, this Awake magazine. To be of support, listen with compassion. Remember, it is usually quite difficult for a victim to talk about what has been happening to her. Your goal should be to strengthen the victim as she deals with the situation at her own pace. Some battered women may need to seek assistance from the authorities. At times, a point of crisis, such as the intervention of the police, can cause an abusive man to see the seriousness of his actions. Admittedly, however, any motivation to change often vanishes once the crisis has passed. Should the battered wife leave her husband? The Bible does not treat marital separation lightly. At the same time, it does not oblige a battered wife to stay with a man who jeopardizes her health and perhaps her very life. The Christian apostle Paul wrote, and it goes on to quote scripture, 1 Corinthians 7 verse 10 to 16. It says, "If she should actually depart, let her remain unmarried, or else make up again with her husband." And the article says, since the Bible does not forbid separation in extreme circumstances, what a woman does in this matter is a personal decision. No one should coax a wife to leave her husband, but neither should anyone pressure a battered woman to stay with a man when her health, life, and spirituality are threatened. In this article, the Watchtower organization actually gives some good advice to spouses who are dealing with physical and verbal abuse. That was 2001. The February 2012 edition of the Watchtower magazine has an article called "Happiness is Possible in a Divided Household." These are the exact words from the article, and I will quote. It says, "Selma recalls a lesson she learned from the witness who studied with her. On one particular day," says Selma, "I didn't want to have a Bible study. The night before, Steve had hit me as I had tried to prove a point, and I was feeling sad and sorry for myself. After I told the sister what had happened and how I felt, she asked me to read 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4 to 7. As I did, I began to reason, Steve never does any of these loving things for me. But the sister made me think differently by asking, how many of those acts of love do you show toward your husband? My answer was none, for he is so difficult to live with. The sister softly said, Selma, who is trying to be a Christian here, you or Steve? Realizing that I needed to adjust my thinking, I prayed to Jehovah to help me be more loving towards Steve. Slowly, things started to change. After 17 years, Steve accepted the truth. Now, if you missed the point of this quote, of this article, let me explain it to you. Selma tells us that she didn't feel like having a Bible study because she was feeling sad and sorry for herself. Why? Because Steve, her husband, had hit her the night before. Why did he hit her? Well, Selma tells us that she had tried to prove a point. So according to Selma, Steve hit her because of something she did. And no one, not even the writers of this article, bothered to point out that Steve has a problem here. None. It doesn't get mentioned in the article. It's all about Selma. No one told her to go to the police or told the reader of this article that they should go to the police if this had ever happened to them. Instead, Selma tells us that she needed to just adjust her thinking. The sister she was studying with had convinced her of this. Now bear in mind that the point of this article is to talk about divided or mixed marriages where one person is a witness and the other is a so-called worldly mate. And marriages to worldly people are mostly forbidden in the Jehovah's Witness religion. This does show that the Watchtower Society, has made some progress on this front. The usual explanation for the change is that spouses can often convert their worldly life partners. But when it comes to women and domestic violence, the whole paragraph feels more than, a very, very backward. So the story with Selma should have been used to counsel women with abusive husbands to seek real help and told them that blaming themselves isn't the answer. But unfortunately, this article simply accepts Selma's personal belief that being hit by her husband was her fault, and it moves on. It could also be said that this article reinforces the old stereotype of the abusive, worldly husband and the powerless Jehovah's Witness sister who is married to him. And this stereotype is especially, evident and very strong with witnesses. I remember in my time as a witness, this was often bandied around. So-called worldly men are abusive most of the time, and the sister is the one that's being the victim. After 17, now remember this article said that after 17 more years of Selma living with Steve, he finally accepted the truth, which means he became a Jehovah's Witness. Is that supposed to be a happy ending to the story? Well, I'm wondering if Steve is still beating Selma. 17 years after the initial story, Selma went on to probably experience and endure 17 years more of abuse. Now, why didn't Selma just divorce Steve? Well, the thing is, Jehovah's Witnesses are only allowed to divorce in cases of infidelity. If Selma had been baptized, she would have been disfellowshipped for divorcing Steve and therefore suffer as what the witnesses call everlasting death at Armageddon. Separation would have been an option, but only so long as she never remarried. Now, Lloyd Evans posted a poll on jwsurvey.org to gauge the feeling amongst people who have read the article. Now, it could have been people who are witnesses and those who ex-witnesses, so it's difficult to gauge who actually took the survey. But let's look at some of the results from that survey. Now, it must be said that this article, which was in 2012, there are similar articles going back to 1958 with similar experiences being recounted in the Watchtower or the Awake. So here are some of the questions that Lloyd Evans on jwsurvey.org asked. He said, the first question was, for the survey was, do you believe that the governing body's writing department was right to include the above experience in the February 2012 Watchtower? 87% answered no, 7% said I'm not sure, 6% said yes. The next question was, do you believe that the above experience could potentially encourage abused wives to stay with their violent husbands? 94% of the people who answered this question said yes, 4% said no, and 2% said I am not sure. The following question, do you believe that the above experience could make women think that they expect to be abused if they do not sufficiently show Christian qualities? 84% said yes, 9% said no, and 7% said I'm not sure. And then the next question, do you believe that the above experience might make violent husbands feel vindicated in abusing wives who do not sufficiently show Christian qualities? 86% said yes, 8% said no, and 6% said I'm not sure. The next question, do you believe that spousal abuse or domestic violence is excusable under any circumstances? 95% said no, 4% said yes, 1% said I'm not sure. So this article, and from what Lloyd, the survey that he conducted on jw.org, it is noteworthy to note that 92% think that the society was wrong to publish the experience, and 84% feel that a retraction should have been published for that experience and for the article, because it basically blames the victim for the abuse. Well, fast forward to 2018 and Watchtower is at it again. Let's look at the latest article. December 2018 Watchtower states this, and I'm going to read an extract from that Watchtower. It says on paragraph 17 of the article, it says, admittedly, there have been instances where an unbelieving husband seems to prove that he is not agreeable to staying with her. He might be extremely physically abusive, even to the point that she feels that her health or life is in danger. He might refuse to support her and the family, or severely endanger her spirituality. In such cases, some Christians have personally decided that despite what he may say, the mate not agreeable to staying together and that a separation is necessary. But other Christians in comparably difficult situations have not. They have endured and tried to work at improving matters. Why? In such a separation, the two are still marriage mates. If they lived apart, each one would face challenges as mentioned earlier. The Apostle Paul gave another reason for saying united. He wrote, "The unbelieving husband is sanctioned in relation to his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctioned in relation to the brother. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy." Then the article goes on to say, many loyal Christians have remained with an unbelieving mate under very trying circumstances. They can testify that doing so was worthwhile in a special sense when their mate became a true worshipper. Right, Watchtower added again, encouraging wives to stay with abusive husbands even though their lives may be in danger. This is despicable and very dangerous advice. Domestic violence is a scourge, and the Watchtower frequently blames the victim for the partner's violence and abusive behavior, especially in the case of women. And that's because of the Watchtower's misogynistic view of women. And I've done a previous episode on the subjective nature of the Watchtower Society and their subjection of women. So here's my parting shot from a former witness woman who made this statement on the webpage on jwsurvey.org. And I quote, she says, "Staying in any abusive relationship is volunteering for victimization, and the emotional and spiritual damages caused by this will not end when you finally have no choice but to walk out the door, and your children may pay an even higher price than you have." So my advice as well is, if you're in a situation like that, whether you are in a Jehovah's Witness or not, get out. Get out. Save yourself. And if children are involved, you might save your children as well. You don't deserve the abuse. That's the show for today. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week. We have a very special celebratory episode. We're coming up for episode 20, and I think it's just fitting that we celebrate the 20th show. And I want to thank you, the listener, for following my journey and for tuning in every week, the loyal listeners, and for engaging with me on the different platforms. I really appreciate that. So listen in. We are really going to celebrate it. It'll be a special episode. So tune in. So until next week, bye for now.